Welcome to all of you who are joining us. I am Daniel Asia, president of the Center for American Culture and Ideas, and you are here for the Cultured Mind Forum. One of the things that we do every other month or so as part of the things that CACI presents to the larger community, both in Arizona, around the United States, and certainly for this presentation around the world. We specialize in culture, particularly the fine arts, the high arts, and then everything that goes into making America the distinctive and exceptional nation that it is. It's for this reason that we are talking today with Dr. Benjamin Ginsberg, who is one of the foremost authorities on anti-Semitism in America, a topic which is rather current for us today, unfortunately. Benjamin Ginsberg is the David Bernstein Professor of Political Science and chair of the Center for Advanced Governmental Studies at the Johns Hopkins University. He is the author, co-author, or editor of only 37 books, including The Fall of the Faculty, Presidential Government, Downsizing Democracy, How the Jews Defeated Hitler, The Fatal Embrace, Jews and the State, Moses of South Carolina, a Jewish scalawag during radical Reconstruction, What Washington Gets Wrong, Warping Time, and the New American Anti-Semitism. And I hold up the book here for you so you can see it. It's a wonderful book. It happens that I have now reviewed the book and it will appear in Academic Questions in about a month or so. So do pick up the book, do read the review. His college text, We the People, now in its 14th edition, has been the nation's most frequently used American government text for the past 3 decades. Ginsberg received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1973 and was professor of government at Cornell until 1992 when he joined the Hopkins faculty. Do know that Professor Ginsberg will speak for anywhere between 20 and 40 minutes. He and I will then engage in a conversation and dialogue, and then we will happily answer your questions, which you can type into the chat. I now give you Dr. Benjamin Ginsberg.
Well, thank you, Dan. I'm delighted to be here. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism has become an important topic these days. American Jews are uncomfortable with, unfamiliar with this growing anti-Semitic agitation, especially since it comes from an unexpected direction. Jews associate anti-Semitism with the right, fascists, Nazis, what have you. And indeed, for many years, I would speak on neo-Nazis in the United States and their secret codes. 88, which stood for HH or Heil Hitler, their use of parentheses to distinguish between Aryans and Jews. So that was a common topic. But now I find myself looking over my left shoulder and talking about anti-Semitism on the political left, which seems to be the chief locus of anti-Semitic activity today. Not that there isn't anti-Semitism on the right, but it's muted. It's in the background. The virulent and violent and visible anti-Semites that we see today are generally organized around left-wing causes, including, of course, the issue of Palestine. Now, in the aftermath of the violent Palestinian attack on Israel and the ferocious Israeli response, we saw an enormous upsurge in anti-Semitic rhetoric in the media, uh, both in the United States and Europe, and on college campuses. Um, College campuses became hotbeds of anti-Semitic activity with students and others on several University of California campuses declaring, Zionist free zones, which were reminiscent of the Nazis' creation of Judenrein uh, spots in cities. Um, and this, Jews have trouble assimilating this. Liberal Jews like to point to evidence of anti-Semitism on the right, but remember the Unite the Right rally that came during the first Trump administration drew a few hundred participants. That was it. Whereas many thousands of anti Semitic demonstrators rallied on college campuses last spring and continue to disrupt activities on colleges and other places, both in the United States and in Europe. Now, many Jews like to say that, oh, well, this is a temporary thing, and it's, of course, related to the Gaza war. But that's utterly untrue. Anti Semitism on the left does have a long history and has been percolating below the surface of American and European politics for quite a long time. The Gaza war, in my view, has been pretextual rather than the cause of anti Semitic activity. And again, there's nothing new here. In the late 19th century, the leader of the German Socialist Party, August Bebel, felt it necessary to caution his members against anti Semitic activities. He called anti Semitism the socialism of fools. And there's something to it even today. Now, those of us who work on college campuses, if we kept our eyes open, have been aware of this for some time. I first, noticed anti-Semitism on the left many years ago when I was a professor at Cornell. A very distinguished um, leftist scholar said to me that he didn't believe that 6 million Jews had been killed in Europe. He thought the number was much, much, much smaller, and that this whole thing had been inflated by Jews for propaganda purposes. Now, this was not a Nazi. This was a very, very prominent scholar of the left. And I was sort of taken aback by this. But, in over the years, this became more and more and more evident. Now, let's consider some terminology here. People argue about whether anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are the same or different. And many will say, well, I am anti-Zionist, but not anti-Semitic. Well, I would say that this is a false distinction. Anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are indeed philosophically distinguishable anyway, but they're so closely related that most anti-Zionists, if you scratch them a little bit, are also anti-Semites. First of all, in the Arab world, they make no distinction whatsoever. The Hamas charter calls for the destruction of the Jews, not the Zionists. And, at Hopkins, I've had quite a few students from the Middle East, students from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and even from Palestine. And all of them have agreed that they were taught to hate Jews. And they were not taught to make a distinction between Jews and Zionists. To them, this they in class discussions, they would often get confused and they would say, well, what are these students talking about? Zionist, Jew, that's all the same, isn't it? To them, it was all the same. Secondly, in the course of political struggle, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism will merge as one, since most of the defenders of Israel are Jews. And inevitably, if you're engaged in political struggle against Jews, uh, it's likely that you'll develop at least a cordial dislike for Jews and not make a fine distinction between Jews and Zionists. And finally, the ongoing demonization of Israel, which we see on college campuses and in the left liberal media, must reflect some underlying anti-Semitic bias. Otherwise, it makes no sense. Consider three common charges against Israel. First, the idea that Israel is an ethno-state. Um, Now, what does this mean? An ethno-state, a state in which one ethnic group uh, controls all the levers of power. Now, I would say that the Muslim states of the Middle East are all ethno-states. Uh, Christians, Jews, others um, generally are marginalized minorities if they're tolerated at all in these states. Israel, by contrast, is a multi-ethnic state. Those of you who have visited Israel, um, the multi-ethnic character of Israel is quite evident. In the Israeli population are quite a few Christians, quite a few Muslims who serve in the parliament and hold political office, and in some cases, if they want, serve in the military, and quite a few Druze. Now, the Druze are an ancient um, religious ethnic group that keeps itself separate from Orthodox Muslims. Uh, the Druze are, the Israeli Druze are extremely loyal to the Israeli state, and they occupy very important positions in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. Quite a number of generals in the most elite units of the IDF are Druze. Uh, Quite a few of the casualties in the fighting that took place over the past year were Druze. And the Druze on the Syrian side of the border are often happy to be protected by Israel because they had would otherwise have been treated terribly by the Assad regime. So Israel is less an ethno-state than any other state of the Middle East. Indeed, less an ethno-state than most states in Europe. Second is the charge that Israel is a product of settler colonialism. Now, this term settler colonialism is a strange one. You know why it's strange? Because it doesn't distinguish any place from any other place. All countries are products of settler colonialism. The unfortunate fact is that every square inch of territory on the face of the earth used to belong to somebody else, was forcibly seized from those people, and probably will belong to someone else in hundreds or of years or millennia from now. That's the unfortunate way of things. So to single out Israel for opprobrium because it's a product of settler colonialism doesn't distinguish Israel from any other state. The US is a product of settler colonialism, but not exactly in the way that some radicals think it is. When European settlers arrived here, they encountered Native American nations who in most cases had only recently seized their land from other Native American nations. They were settler colonialists too. That's the brutal way of the world. Everybody is a settler colonialist. Israel, in some ways, less than the others. Uh, you know, if you examine the antiquities um, in Israel, those are Jewish antiquities for the most part. The Jews were there 3 millennia ago, 4 millennia ago, long before there was such a thing as Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians. The Jews have a better claim than anybody else. And in modern times, uh, the Jews were handed that land first by the League of Nations, then by the United Nations, uh, to some extent, whether they wanted it or not. Because in displaced persons camps in Europe, a suppressed referendum revealed that most Jews wanted to come to the United States. Now, I can tell you this for a fact because I, as a kid, uh, was resident in a displaced persons camp with my parents. In these camps, there were 400,000 survivors of the 7 million Jews who had lived in Eastern Europe prior to the Nazis. My parents wanted to go to the United States, and fortunately, were able to find a long lost relative who would sponsor them. Uh, but President Truman and the Democratic administration didn't want to bring in all these Jews. They wanted to find a different place for them, and they sent them all to Israel, whether they wanted to go or not. Um, Finally, the Israeli government is said to be brutal and repressive. But compared to what? All states are capable of brutality and repression. Uh, I recommend to everyone that they read Nietzsche's great work, Thus Spake Zarathustra. And Nietzsche has Zarathustra say, the state is a cold, cold monster. And he's right. States are cold. They're indifferent to human suffering. That's a characteristic of all states. They try to hide it, but when it comes down to it, states are capable, all states are capable of brutal action. Now, among the states of the Middle East, I would have to say that Israel doesn't rank at the top when it comes to brutality. Most of the states of the Middle East are theocracies, kleptocracies, brutal dictatorships. Israel is a parliamentary democracy. It's not perfect by any means, but no state is perfect by any means. Look at the history of any existing state, and you'll find terrible behavior. When President Trump declared that he wanted Greenland added to the United States, one of my colleagues, a physics professor, a Danish physics professor, said that's outrageous. And I said, well, Danish colonialism in Greenland was quite brutal. He said, oh, no, that's not true. I said, yes, it is, because under Danish rule, a strong effort was made to stamp out the Inuit religion and culture. And little Inuit children were sent to Danish schools where they were taught Danish rather than their own language. Denmark, which we regard as such a wonderful place, though I confess I was always dubious about it. But at any rate, Denmark was as brutal as anybody else. Uh, a cold, cold monster. So if we ranked cold monsters, I don't think Israel would be the worst. In a world that includes North Korea, uh, maybe North Korea would be first, followed by Iran. I mean, there are an awful lot of terrible, terrible, terrible states. China, which is engaged in genocidal activities against the Uyghurs. Uh, why don't we have anti-North Korean demonstrations? Why anti-Israel? I would say that underneath the anti-Zionist charges, uh, bubbles up a lot of anti-Semitism. So I would say that these progressive ideas are not only wrong, but are extremely pernicious. Um, they legitimate anti-Jewish rhetoric, and they divide and confuse the Jews themselves, especially young people who want to fit in at school among their liberal friends, uh, and really don't know much about history. Now, I've taught at two elite universities, Cornell and Johns Hopkins, and I have to tell you that the kids don't know anything about history. I don't know what they learn in high school. I like to ask in class, can anyone tell me anything at all about the Ottoman Empire? Once in a while, somebody can say a few words about it, but if you want to understand the contemporary history of the Middle East, that's a pretty good place to start, since most of the countries of the Middle East were carved out of the Ottoman Empire by the British Foreign Office. That's why the borders are often straight lines, right? Um, I used to joke that my students could only knew the difference between World War I and World War II because they were numbered. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to tell me. Um, in fact, a colleague of mine said, "You know why they don't know anything? You should read the history texts that they read in high school." She gave me a copy of the AP, the Advanced Placement History text, used in Montgomery County, Maryland high schools. This is a pretty wealthy area. And I learned by reading that book that the United States actually started World War II. Did you know that? Until I read that book, I didn't know that. I also learned that Soviet and Chinese collectivization were far less damaging, far less murderous than American capitalism. Now, Mao Zedong would have been angry if he read that because during Chinese agricultural collectivization, 20 million people died. And Mao believed that the quality of a revolutionary was a function of the number of people he killed. So those 20 million put him on top, ahead of Stalin, ahead of Hitler. So he would have been furious if he had to lose those 20 million murders. Now, according to this book, it wasn't that Mao deliberately killed people, it was that the weather was bad. They were victims of bad weather. Um, so this is why kids don't know any history. They're not taught anything in their high school history classes. So, Jews have for a long time been liberal Democrats, and some in the Jewish community cling to the idea that there's a difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that allows them to remain progressive while being Jews. I often tell friends, Mecca, you've got to choose. Right now, you can't be progressive and a Jew at the same time. I know that some of you won't like that, but that's just how it is. And, we have groups uh, like Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, Bend the Arc, and various others that try to make this fine distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. They're desperate to remain part of the liberal coalition and not have to, you know, say, okay, we're not Jews anymore. Well, it doesn't work. Left liberal Jews are suspect in the liberal coalition. They're like the conversos of 16th century Spain. They try to be what the Germans called Päpstlichkeit den Papst, but it doesn't work. Um, I want to conclude by saying a few words about how anti-Semitism, which was mainly a right-wing ideology, became a progressive ideology. This began in Europe as a confluence of two factors. First, the 1967 Israel-Arab War, which demonstrated that Israel was a regional power. Israel had been a little tiny socialist state where socialist politicians used to like to go to have their pictures taken on a kibbutz. I think there's a picture of Bernie Sanders riding a tractor on a kibbutz. If you Google it, you might find it. So Israel was a little tiny socialist state, but now all of a sudden it was a power. And the United States began arming Israel because the US saw Israel as potentially a useful ally in the Middle East. Now, American policy in the Middle East is based on a three-letter word, but that three-letter word is not Jew, it's oil. American policy in the Middle East has had to do with privileged access to Middle Eastern oil fields, protecting the oil fields from radical Muslim regimes and whatnot. And Israel was seen as a useful force there. Now, what seemed obvious to American policymakers offended members of the European and American left. Israel was now not a socialist state, but now seemed part of the evil empire. And moreover, in Europe, thousands and thousands of Muslim immigrants were arriving. Socialist parties saw these Muslim immigrants as potential socialist voters and began looking for ways to attract them. Now, Muslim immigrants were not much interested in the ideas of Karl Marx, so Marx wasn't relevant to them. However, European socialists and Muslim immigrants could agree on one thing, and that was Zionism. So Zionism became a rallying cry for European socialists because it was politically useful. It allowed them to rally the votes of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Muslim immigrants. Now, anti-Zionism came to the United States through college campuses. After the Vietnam War, college and university faculties moved sharply to the left. And they, like their European counterparts, saw Israel as an agent of American imperialism. At the same time, Muslim student groups like Students for Justice in Palestine began to be active on college campuses where they joined the ecosystem of progressive politics through the doctrine of intersectionality. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this idea. Intersectionality is the idea that all forms of oppression are ultimately related. So oppressed people should band together regardless of the particular form of oppression that they oppose. This is why we saw such weird things during the protests of last spring, as you know, what was it? Queers for Gaza, I think was the name of the group. LGBTQ students marching on behalf of the Palestinian cause. I know a friend of mine who is Persian walked by an encampment on the George Washington University campus where he saw a sign for Queers for Gaza, and he stopped and he said, "You know, in Gaza they would kill you." And they said, "Oh no, that's not true. That's just propaganda." And he shook his head because he knew very well that in Iran they would kill them almost anywhere in the Middle East. But anyway, this is intersectionality. So university administrators, for their part, try to be above the battle, try to stay out of the firing line by taking no position whatsoever. And we saw this during the testimony of I call them the Three Stooges, the presidents of Harvard, Penn, and MIT, who were desperate to not say that students running around the campus screaming for death to the Jews were engaged in anti-Semitic activity. They were splitting hairs there, as advised by their law firm. So against this backdrop, We have radical groups like George Soros's Open Society Foundation, the Tides Foundation, a number of others who fund all sorts of progressive causes drawn to the anti-Zionist cause. Why? Well, on the left, like on the right, like everywhere else, all causes have a half-life. And people on the left are always looking for a new cause that will stir up the enthusiasm of the usually kids, college students. College students on any given day can believe almost anything. So these progressive foundations poured money into the anti-Zionist effort, and the result was, we remember the encampments. Now, I was on the phone one day with a reporter from Austria. She wrote for Die Presse, which is an old newspaper in Vienna. Karl Marx was their correspondent at one time. And she said to me, you Americans are so naive. Uh, because don't you see what these encampments are? I said, yeah, they're Hitler Youth camp. She said, exactly right. Uh, you bring a bunch of impressionable young people out into these romantic encampments. There's a whiff of revolution in the air, and they meet with older, fighters, and you get converts for the cause. And if they're arrested, all the better, because that once someone is arrested, that sets them along the revolutionary path. Well, at any rate, let me conclude with a few thoughts. What is to be done? Um, One is consciousness. Lenin said everything begins with consciousness, and even we conservatives can read Lenin and learn. Uh, you have to understand that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism cannot be meaningfully separated. For the most part, anti-Zionists dislike Jews. And in many instances, their anti-Zionism has its roots in anti-Semitism. Second, it's important to fight against each and every anti-Semitic politician. If they complain that the Jews are out to get them, tell them it's true. The Jews are out to get them. And so, third, don't be afraid of allies on the right. Hannah Arendt, the great German Jewish philosopher, wrote that the Jews think they're smart, but they don't understand politics. Because in politics, you have to be flexible. Your friends one day might be your enemies the next day. Jews are so frozen on the political left. They can't see when that's no longer the appropriate place to be. They can't see that the left has abandoned them. Whereas forces on the right welcome the Jews, the Christian Zionists, for example. Now, I always tell tell Jewish friends, the Christian Zionists are strongly pro-Israel. And they say, no, you don't understand. They just want to convert us. I say that thought is because you don't understand their theology. They believe that when Jesus returns, the Jews will all convert anyway. So they don't need to waste resources now on converting the Jews because they got them anyway. Fourth, don't be, for Jewish listeners will understand what this means. Don't be a Shabbos Jew. That means don't be focused on ritual over identification. This is one of the problems with Jewish day school. I've taught many graduates of Jewish day schools who knew a lot of ritual, but didn't know anything about Jewish history. They were lost. They were Shabbos Jews, and they didn't understand that much of the ritual was created in order to facilitate, to maintain identity. Next, don't be what the Russians used to call Polezhnya Duraki, useful idiots. Polezhnya Duraki. That's what the Russians called foreign comrades who fought for socialism. Now, the Soviet leadership knew these people were fools. They were betraying their own country because of ideological stupidity. Bolesnya Daraki. And then finally, don't think it can't happen here. When a country turns against the Jews, that happens quickly. Jews are less well integrated into the United States than people think. Many Americans have never met a Jew. Jews are well integrated into the bi-coastal upper middle class. But in the Southwest, upper Midwest, many people have never met a Jew, have no idea what they think of them. I had a friend whose parents owned a furniture store in a little town in Indiana. And he thought, whoa, the people here are really friendly. Whenever they come into the store, they pat me on the head. Then he learned that they patted him on the head because they believed that Jews had little horns and they were patting him to find those little horns. So, Jews are not as fully integrated into America as they would like to be, as they think they are. And as a result, it can happen here. So I'm going to stop there. And I guess Dan is going to be next. So, Dan, do you want
Yes,
to?
yes, I'm returning. I'm returning. Here we are. Thank you very much, Dr. Ginsberg, for your remarks. Let me start with a broad question. You spoke a good bit about students at the university and their buy-in, as it were, to a pretty virulent anti-Semitism. I think we can agree. Can you talk a little bit about how the university got to this point where it would in fact be promoting and or teaching anti-Semitic language and anti-Semitic
Yeah.
beliefs? You mentioned
Uh,
intersectionality,
yeah.
but perhaps other
Yeah, there are a
things.
number of forces. First of all, most universities are liberal institutions. There are very few conservative faculty at major American universities. Conservatives are shunned. A known Republican will not be hired um, in the social sciences, humanities, at any major American university. And this goes back to the events of the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, younger faculty aligned themselves with militant student groups. And in those battles, more conservative, older faculty were vilified, retired, and the younger, more progressive faculty gradually took over the reins of hiring. So there are no conservative, I mean, here and there, you find a conservative faculty member at an American college. Now, I think that's intellectually outrageous because colleges are sort of monocultural. No debate, no dispute, everyone agrees. So the students aren't presented with alternatives. So that's the faculty. Faculty is left, is on the left. Students are quite unwilling to state their views in class if they happen to disagree with what seems to be the liberal consensus. And, any conservative student is gradually sort of worn down. Not any, but many are sort of worn down because they can't, how do you go through 4 years of school with everybody disagreeing with you? Um, and it's not that all these kids, not the Jewish kids, come in being anti-Israel, but if they are politically progressive in other ways, they become part of the progressive ecosystem uh, where anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism is one part of the progressive belief system. So that you had large numbers of Jewish students at Columbia holding their Passover seders in the encampments. I thought that was just shameful, shameful and outrageous, because they are celebrating the liberation of the Jews in a tent built to kick the Jews out of the Holy Land. Does that make any sense? None whatsoever. But in the liberal monoculture, that that's sensible, just like Queers for Gaza is sensible. Um, so right now, a conservative student is very out of place um, on an elite university campus. I urge conservative students to go to school in the South, go to Wake Forest rather than Harvard, go to Wash U in St. Louis rather than Yale. Those are excellent schools, and they are not part of the liberal monoculture.
Why is it that you think this issue has been able to dominate in non-historical, as it were, fields in the university? In other words, we don't just find this in history of a post Edward Said understanding of how the Middle East came to be, but we find it throughout the arts, throughout the social sciences. One of our students asked, why is this lecture being given in this class? The class that is participating is human achievement and innovation in the arts. Well, one reason is because we invite them to participate in a larger intellectual environment, dealing with issues that they probably are not going to confront otherwise, but also because the issue of anti-Semitism and Jews in the arts is a prominent one right now, as we
Sure.
just saw, for example, in the release of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, or the upcoming release, should it actually be released, or in the Academy Awards. How is it that it has become so ubiquitous in the universities? And as you said, it's not a half culture, it's a monoculture that is impossible to penetrate.
Well, the particular issue of anti-Semitism is, I don't want to be cynical about this, but it's the issue du jour. Um, just as when I was a student, opposition to militarism and imperialism suddenly were the great issues. Um, for institutions and foundations on the left, there is always a search for the new issue. Um, you know, Everyone thinks that issues sort of percolate up from the bottom, but they don't. Um, in Washington, I know lots of people who work as issues consultants. That is their job, is to invent issues that politicians and contending political forces might use for their advantage. And every once in a while, one of these issues just takes off. And there's always a search for the next big thing, the new issue that will electrify and mobilize lots of young people. Young people are the ones who are most likely um, to be affected by new issues. Young people are looking for things to believe in. Dan, people our age, we're cynical. Uh, we've seen lots of issues come and go. But if you're looking for issues to electrify young people, well, abortion was such an issue. Um, War and peace, the Vietnam War was such an issue. The issue du jour is anti-Zionism. And if you deconstruct that issue, does it make any sense? Is Israel the great malefactor? Gee, and again, in a globe that includes North Korea, Iran, Afghanistan, and all these brutal countries, why why agitate against Israel? But it doesn't have to make sense. There is a constituency for it. It started with Middle Eastern students, but then it spread through intersectionality to other segments um, of the progressive school culture. So that today, a student who is politically progressive will not be accepted unless they're anti-Zionist. A
Mm.
progressive student has to declare their anti-Zionist bona fides, especially so if they're Jewish, because as I said before, Jewish students aren't trusted uh, because who knows, maybe they're crypto-Zionists. We don't know.
Okay, I'm going to go to a few questions. Can you discuss whether there's one primary cause or instead a series, I'm assuming that means over time, of causes of the anti-intellectual, revisionist historical, anti-Semitic currents that contribute to the ignorance of college students and an
Uh,
environment more
yeah,
broadly in which anti-Semitism can flourish?
it's not one cause. There are background conditions. One background condition is that students' minds are kind of blank slates. They don't know anything about history, so they're prepared to believe uh, anything that is told to them with great sincerity. So, last spring, someone got a lot of mileage out of observing many of the students chanting from the river to the sea couldn't name the river or the sea. Um, well, I wasn't shocked by that. I knew my students couldn't either. And mine are students in an elite school where it's very hard to get into. Um, so that, when you start with kids who don't know anything about history, who in high school were probably exposed to a relatively progressive version of history, most high school classes make use of text materials that they get from, Howard Zinn and other uh, progressive historical groups. So that's a background condition. Um, Secondly, in these schools, groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, they were very important, became active within the progressive ecosystem. And in the progressive ecosystem, you are obligated to support other people's causes, not just your own. That's intersectionality. So to be accepted within uh, the politically progressive ecosystem of your school, chances are you had to be an anti-Zionist. Now, a small number of kids said, no, that's going too far. And some of them became conservatives. Um, and some tried to be progressive and pro-Israel, but that's increasingly difficult because you don't have any friends at all. So that's how it happened. It happened gradually. The faculty became left liberal, in the late 60s. And as I said, a known conservative will not be hired in the humanities or social sciences at any elite university.
Mhm.
Their work will be found wanting.
Yeah, yeah. So here's the question. I queried the questioner. So, but the question remains, how do you explain the rise in Zionism? And I will assume, but I don't assume, I'll let you figure out what you assume in Zionism in American society.
Anti-Zionism or Zionism?
No, Zionism, Zionism. I'm assuming, since you've already spoken about the rise of Zionism and philo-Semitism among Christians, how that has occurred.
Well, among Christians, the answer is very interesting. Um, and this goes back to the 19th century, um, when a number of Christian ministers, particularly the tent revivalists, were looking for a mode of presenting their religious beliefs that would bring in worshipers. And they hit upon something that you probably never heard of, premillennial, or that nobody in the audience has heard of, premillennial dispensationalism. And this was the idea that the history of the world um, was divided into, dispensations, eras, and these all would lead to uh, the end of this world and the return of Jesus, the judgment of nations. Uh, this and the devil would be cast into the sea of molten lava. Well, this religious presentation became powerful, and the evangelicals, as they began to call themselves, captured the marketplace. So at the outset, there were only a small number of them and lots of mainline Protestants. But today, there are many more evangelicals than there are, mainstream Protestants, Methodists, and Episcopalians and whatnot. And the evangelical churches are bursting to the seams on Sunday, whereas the others are kind of empty. So there was a big shift in Christian theology and belief. And in that belief system, Zionism was very important um, because um, the return of Jesus depended upon, among other things, the return of the Jews to the Holy Land. So, the 67 war was was breathtaking for Christian Zionists because the Jews recaptured the holy places, and now became obvious to them that wouldn't be long now before Jesus returned. So this is why a large number of Christians became Zionists. Um, as to Jews, well, this varies. The Orthodox identify strongly with Judaism, and with the exception of a few sects that are anti-Israel, the Orthodox believe in the state of Israel. So in Israel itself, as you may know, almost every evangelical church has a baptismal spot on the Jordan River where they bring their parishioners every year.
So another question, in response to the increasing anti-Semitic activities on university campuses, what specific measures, now this brings us to our present government, should the governments or educational institutions in the United States and Europe take to effectively contain and reverse this trend?
Well, look, I know a lot of people think that the government of the United States should not intervene in higher education, but I disagree. Educational institutions have shown by their actions that they are incapable of managing anti Semitic activity on their campuses. Uh, Jewish students at Columbia have lived in fear for the past year. Jewish students at University of California campuses have been banned from parts of the campus. Um, Jewish students attending a class at Columbia saw their class disrupted, and university administrators can't deal with this. And even if they want to, let's take Columbia, which everyone said, oh, Columbia has surrendered to Trump. This is very bad. But the truth of the matter is that the Columbia administration wanted to do these things. They wanted to restore order on the campus. They wanted to suspend and expel radical students who disrupted classes. They couldn't do it because the left liberal faculty, left liberal students, the left liberal community. So they were more than happy. I got a call one day from the one of the education rags, Chronicle of Higher Ed or Inside Higher Ed, asking me what I thought. And I said, well, my guess is that the Columbia administration will very quickly surrender to Trump's demands because these are things they want to do. And this gives them an excuse. So I would say that universities have failed to manage their own affairs. They failed to create, what they like to call a safe space for Jewish students. And without the support and intervention of the federal government, there's no hope that they can uh, regain authority over their own campuses. And I'll tell you another thing. If you juxtapose, and I urge people to do this on their own, juxtapose two maps. One, which shows the most virulent campus demonstrations of last spring, and a second, which shows the 70 or so social justice prosecutors elected with the support of the Soros organization. The two are pretty much related because student demonstrators knew that they were safe in jurisdictions where the prosecutor was a social justice prosecutor and wouldn't bring charges. Alvin Bragg, for example, in New York, wouldn't bring charges against any of the Columbia demonstrators. So, what was the university administration supposed to do? They knew that these people had to be gotten off the campus, but they weren't in a position to do anything. So, I think, you know, that the evil Trump saved them.
How do you think we can better tackle the problem of educating people about anti-Semitism? And the question asks also, without fueling further division,
Yeah.
how do you do it nice?
Yeah. Well, I think that if we start teaching history in a reasonable way, if we don't teach students that Chinese collectivization, wasn't so bad, 20 million people, but there's the bad weather. If we do that, then we're ready to start teaching, a realistic history of the United States, uh, a history in which, um, to be sure, there have been there's been racism, anti-Semitism, ethnic prejudice, um, but seriously, the United States, more than any other country, has recognized and sought to combat these things, which we should continue to do. Now, American students, they think all they know is America, so they think since America isn't perfect, it must be evil. But I'll tell you a little factoid, and that is when you survey recent Latin immigrants um, who have a basis for comparison, they say America is wonderful because they have a basis for comparison. Whereas American kids don't know, and all they know is the crap they're taught in their high school classes. So I don't think you can begin to combat anti Semitism, racism, uh, until you get, develop some mechanism for teaching history in an honest way.
So I'll ask the following question from one of our participants. It pertains to what you just said, I think. Do you think historical context, now I'm putting quotes around the word context, do you think historical context plays a significant role in shaping people's views on the Israel-Palestine conflict? And would these
Oh,
views change based on one
absolutely.
political
Absolutely.
perspective?
You know, history is everything. If you teach people, and I did a book um, entitled Warping Time, which where I did a series of experiments showing that what you told people about the past affects their views of what they should be done in the present. Um, so, we, if you teach people that the history of Israel is vicious and violent settler colonialism, well, then of course, Israel must be a bad place. If you teach people the truth, which is that the Jews lived in that world for thousands of years. The antiquities are Jewish, and the return of the Jews to Israel is something brokered by the United Nations. um, Israel begins to look a little different. So I think historical context is everything. If you let me write the history, I will reshape people's views of the present. There was a Chinese poet who said, in destroying the kingdoms of man, the first thing you do is destroy their history. And that was very wise.
Also, it was true of the Soviet Union to keep
Absolutely.
control, to keep rewriting history all of the time,
Keep
wasn't it?
rewriting history. And I mean, Orwell, those who have never read Orwell's 1984, which I'm told is not read in high school classes anymore. I don't know what they read. Um, but, Orwell understood this very well.
Yeah. So we're at 6 o'clock, Dr. Ginsberg. I'm going to ask you one last question, which is it's a nice one. Are there any books or resources you can recommend that may provide a more balanced history lesson than the more progressive history we've been taught in school? How do you help these
Well,
kids? How do you help
yeah,
everybody, anybody?
I would suggest, I mean, my my own book, The Fatal Embrace, Jews and the State, and also How the Jews Defeated Hitler, both tell history, I think, accurately, and are filled with footnotes for those who want to read more. So, perhaps it's egocentric to recommend my own books, but if I don't, who will?
No, I think it's perfectly reasonable. And I think as a final comment, I'll just say I would heartily recommend, having read and now reviewed Dr. Ginsburg's book, The New American Anti-Semitism, that you look it up and that you read it. It will give you a very full version, even a fuller version. Perhaps we could consider Dr. Ginsburg's presentation today an introduction in many ways. And you can go a bit deeper in his book, as he did, to answer many of the questions that you have. I think I'll finish with one final comment. So I was a student of the Holocaust in college. So I am aware that 6 million Jews, in fact, not a smaller number, were destroyed, murdered, burnt by the Nazis. And one book that came out very early on was by a wonderful historian named Raoul Hilberg, called The Destruction of European Jewry. And what Hilberg said was, it really isn't so surprising what happened in Germany. It's surprising perhaps that it happened in Germany. But he said there were progressively things that occurred in the history of Europe and in the history of the Jews' interaction with Europe that allowed these things to happen. And he talked about the dehumanization of Jews, the incursion of anti-Semitism in Christianity, then the progressive taking away of Jewish property, and then finally dehumanizing Jews so that they were isolated in ghettos. He said all of this was simply a step-by-step process that allowed one then to finally get to what we term the final solution. So I'll simply leave all of you with the question, how do we make sure, as we Jews say, perhaps ad nauseum, that this should never happen again? And it shouldn't happen again to anybody. I'll add that. But unfortunately, it particularly happens to the Jews. So I would ask that all of you take this as a request to think about how you can make sure that Jews are safe in America and your Jewish friends are safe. And part of that simply is a matter of taking courageous actions and thoughts. Not just thoughts, but thinking good things and then acting upon them. What the world needs now is people who have courage to fight against evil that exists in the world. So I thank all of you. I thank Dr. Ginsberg for being with us in
My pleasure.
particular. And for all of you who have joined us for this webinar, do sign up so that you will know about future webinars and about future activities of the Center for American Culture and Ideas. So I bid you adieu wherever you are, no matter how late or how early it is. And thank you for having joined us. Thank you, Dr. Ginsberg.
My pleasure.